Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nate. I'm with DOE. I have 1 o'clock Eastern exactly. We'll start in about 1 minute. I see our numbers ticking up. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Okay, my clock has just ticked over to 102, and I see we have 120 folks here right now. I expect that 125. I expect that number to go up based off of the registration list that we were looking at just before this call. For anyone who has joined in the last minute or so, today's webinar will be recorded. It will also be archived then on the Better Building Solutions Center. You'll receive a link once it's posted. All attendees are in listen only mode. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, at least what's at the bottom of my screen, to communicate with us. And I think with that, I've covered the housekeeping items. So I'll say hello and thank you for joining us for today's Better Buildings webinar about the portfolio emissions reduction planning work that we've been doing recently. I am really excited for today's webinar. I like to think all of our webinars are great, but this one especially so because it represents a milestone in our work with partners, and we have a new resource to share. So let's jump in and go to the next slide. I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Nate Allen. I'm a program manager in our building technologies office, and I've been working with Better Buildings for about 5 years now across the commercial and public sectors. I am joined by my colleague Hannah Kramer from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and two members of our outstanding technical account managers team, both of them bring their own industry expertise to their roles. That's Tom Abram from Introba and Stet Sanborn from Smith Group. We have a lot of content. We're going to cover this. Let's go quickly here on to the next slide. Our main topic for today is to review and share a new resource for emissions reduction planning at the building portfolio level. We'll go over the milestones and guidance within, and then Tom and Stet will engage in what I'm sure will be an entertaining discussion about the content. In a moment, I'll hand it over to Hannah Kramer to review this resource. And I want to give credit to Hannah and Nora and Jessica and the team at LBL who've done terrific work pulling this resource together. The impetus for the content is pulled directly from partners who helped us identify the need for this resource through our work together in the Better Climate Challenge. And let's go to the next slide to talk briefly about that. There we go. Almost 1 year ago exactly, I think it was about 51 weeks ago, we launched the Better Climate Challenge as a new pathway within the Better Buildings Initiative. We are challenging organizations to reduce scopes 1 and 2 GHG emissions across their portfolios within 10 years. And in the time since we've launched this new pathway, we've welcomed more than 150 partner organizations across the commercial, public, multifamily, and industrial sectors. The foundation of our partnership is to understand how best to help these market leaders to meet their goal and do so in a way that produces information and resources helpful to others. And that leads me to our next slide. I want to talk about our working groups and specifically what we've been doing that brings us to a call today. So last spring at the Better Buildings Summit, and side note, I hope everyone on this call joins us this April for the Better Buildings Summit here in DC. You'll get registration info at the end of this call. So last spring, we launched a working group for emissions reduction planning. This is based on the feedback we heard from our partners about what they needed. More than 40 organizations joined this working group and have helped scope the content that you'll hear about in a moment. We are grateful for their involvement and input. You can see the list here on the screen. And I think the last point I'll make on this slide before I hand it to Hannah is that this is the first big resource that we've released as part of the Better Climate Challenge. Many hands, as you can see, contributed to this work, as well as more that are listed within the beginning of the resource. And I think we've landed on something that's very useful. We are really appreciative to the broad community, many of whom I see on our attendee list here for this call, that's helped get this to where it is. And we're looking forward to making a bigger splash about this resource at the summit this spring when the industrial sector complement is released. More on that later. I was told to go quickly and take about 5 minutes, and I think I've done that. So Hannah, I'm going to pass to you.
Excellent. Nice job, Nate. Next slide, please. So if you're familiar with Better Buildings, we use slido.com to do the Q&A. So I'll be managing the Q&A throughout. Please go to slido.com, either on your computer or on your mobile device, and the event code is DOE. Put in your questions throughout. I'll be grouping questions. We have a lot of folks on the line today, so we won't be able to get through everything. If you put your name with your question, we can get back to you later, potentially, depending on how many we have. And you can select thumbs up as usual for the questions that you like. So I'll be managing the queue of those questions. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide is really an overview of what we're getting at with the portfolio level emission reduction plan. We looked at the industry and saw a lot of focus on climate action planning, and then also on building level audits, mostly energy audits, actually. Now it's morphing into emission reduction audits. And so the purpose of the emission reduction planning document is to give guidance on scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions at the portfolio level for buildings and fleets of vehicles. So that's the niche we're trying to thread the needle on, and really a process framework. So underneath that will be all sorts of tools and screening tools and protocols and a greenhouse gas inventory and tracking tools. What we're talking about is the process to get from your goals and your sustainability and climate action planning to the details of how you're going to execute that at the portfolio level. Our target audience is commercial, multifamily, and institutional organizations. And we really have tried to create a framework that sort of applies to across the board in the commercial, multifamily, institutional sector. I just want to mention a couple of the benefits of doing this kind of planning versus the alternative, which is, create a climate action plan, engaging stakeholders and sharing your targets broadly across your stakeholders, and then diving in and doing a bunch of projects. That's what we actually have found that most people are doing. They really see the benefit of getting a lot of head start, getting those pilots out there. Which is great, but it also doesn't give them the line of sight into what that's going to get them in meeting their 2030, 2040, 2050 goals. So the portfolio level emission reduction plan really helps analyze multiple scenarios, identify which strategies to pursue, and what sort of early decisions might impact into those future 20-year out scenarios. So it's giving stakeholders confidence that the organization can turn those ambitious targets that are communicated in your climate action plan into actual action. I will also mention at the building level, we've developed an emission reduction audit checklist for owners. So this is a companion document to the framework for emission reduction planning. And when we get to that step in the framework, Tom and Stet are going to sort of go and describe a little bit about the emission reduction audit. We'll have a separate webinar just about the emission reduction audit because there's lots to talk about there on how to move energy audits into emission reduction audits. Next, please. So this just is to also reiterate that we have tools that, tools across the board. They may be sector specific. They may be performance tracking tools, ESG tools can support this strategy. And so there's in the review process, there was sometimes questions about, well, how does my tool relate to this? Well, you'll see how the framework kind of unfolds and how it can be supported by many different kind of operationalizing within the tools and protocols. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to do a quick poll in Slido. So if you go over to slido.com and enter DOE, we want to hear from you on what items your organization has completed. This will be an interesting way to see where we're all at. Nobody has completed everything, and it's always a work in progress. So we have the greenhouse gas inventory, emission reduction targets, your climate action plan or other higher level plan, whether you've rolled out energy efficiency measures across your portfolio. LED lighting is just one of those kind of portfolio type measures. You may have done BAS upgrades. Have you completed one or more emission reduction audits or decarbonization audits, which is a newer type of audit out there in industry, or integrated decarbonization throughout organizational policies? So do you have renovation requirements that require certain levels of decarb, that require some electrification, things like that? Okay, so we're going to go over to Slido and give people a couple of minutes here, or actually probably less than that. We have a lot to cover today. So we have a lot of folks have done energy efficiency measures across the portfolio. That has been our focus for so many years, is energy efficiency, and now we're adding things to it. Makes it a bit more complicated, things like electrification, heat pumps, so forth. We have a lot of folks selecting emission reduction targets. About half have climate action plans. All right, so we're gonna, you can keep answering this question. We're going to move on to the next slide, and in the interest of time, we'll leave that question open. So now I'm gonna transition over to Tom Abram, who's going to talk about the framework and how it kind of plays out in terms of the milestones that we talk about in the framework.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So one of the challenges that we've seen organizations encounter is how to develop a decarbonization plan and emissions reduction plan at the portfolio level, especially when there are large and diverse portfolios at play. It can be challenging to look at how do we translate the opportunities at the building level to the overall portfolio level and vice versa. So what this framework does is it provides an approach to categorize your portfolio into meaningful groups of buildings, assessing opportunities in representative buildings within each of these categories, and then scaling these results back up at the portfolio level. This allows you to develop scenarios and select and define a selected decarbonization pathway for the organization. By starting off at first at the portfolio level, zooming into groups and then individual buildings, and then scaling back up the portfolio, organizations can develop an actionable emissions reduction plan. Next. So within this framework for emissions reduction planning for building portfolios, we have 5 milestones that we've categorized the framework into. The first milestone is establishing the greenhouse gas inventory, as well as the scope of work for the emissions reduction planning effort. With this milestone, which based on the results, which is not surprising, a lot of folks already have greenhouse gas inventories, but we certainly want to make sure that this is a component that that is included for organizations that have not done so yet, as well as establishing targets for the organization. After developing the scope of work to identify what is really needed for the stakeholders to make a decision, we move on to milestone 2, which is categorizing the portfolio. So this is looking at what are the different key characteristics within the buildings, what are the ways that groups of buildings and individual buildings differentiate from each other, and how might that lead to different decarbonization strategies. After developing this category, selecting some representative buildings for future study, we moved to milestone 3, where we're assessing these measures, completing decarbonization audits and assessments at the individual building level, and then also looking at portfolio-wide approaches. Moving into milestone 4, we're developing scenarios where we combine the previous assessments. We look at phasing, financing options to develop scenarios for the organization to consider as their selected decarbonization pathway, which occurs in milestone 5, at which point we also provide recommendations on how to define the plan even further. And then coming from that is implementation. We know that many people are already implementing various decarbonization components, but we anticipate when there's alignment with this emissions reduction plan that we can see a greater success and speed and depth of decarbonization implementation. Next, please. So with milestone 1, the high level purpose is looking at ensuring that the organization's commitment to developing and implementing the ERP will be successful. So this is really trying to tease out who are the individual stakeholders, either internal or external, who needs to be involved, what are their needs, what needs to be included in the emissions reduction plan development to make sure that their needs are being met and that there can be buy-in at the organizational level. Then we develop the greenhouse gas inventory if this hasn't been done already, as well as the emissions reduction targets. Then we ask the organizations to define individual evaluation criteria to really understand how will an organization evaluate these potential scenarios in order to select one that best meets the organization's needs. And further developing a scope of work that could be utilized either internally or in partnership with external consultants. Stet, I'm wondering, are there any, you have any thoughts on best practices for creating the scope of work for an ERP? Any pitfalls?
I mean, I would say like one of the really important things is trying to build on efforts that have already gone underway or content that you've already developed. The whole process for defining the scope of work and really establishing your inventory can be overwhelming for folks that haven't started. Now, from the survey results, a lot of you have already gotten sort of to that level, which is amazing. For those that haven't, for that third that haven't gotten there yet, you likely have content within your organization that you can build from. And so that could be, even your facilities folks might have condition assessment reports that they've established for different buildings and different equipment. That's a great place to start and build onto that as you develop your inventory list and start tracking down your utility bills and things like that. So definitely leveraging what you already have so that you don't feel like everything within your plan is from scratch, because it's likely you have a lot of stuff already underway that you can leverage.
Yeah, that's a great thought, Stet. And I think we can certainly look at, with this framework, it's intended to be able to provide an overview, a guidance on how you would develop this emissions reduction plan, and understanding that there might be flexibility, there might be different needs for the organization, but this is the overall approach that we believe will lead to a successful development of ERPs. Yeah. And one of the needs I see is really moving beyond some of these plans from the aspirational to kind of the more of a commitment. So that really kind of relies on finding the right path and getting that buy-in from the organization. Any lessons learned on how we might best set yourself up for success in this step?
Well, I think you said it earlier in really well, of finding those co-champions within your organization. It can be daunting from a task if you feel like you as maybe a sustainability lead for your organization have to do this all on your own. Success will be even, way easier if you also can find your co-champions, and they could be within your work group, or they could be, even a property manager at a certain property. And so finding those folks that can help you develop this will, again, build in that buy-in and get that critical mass of folks that you need to sort of be able to launch a project like this.
That's great. Next slide, please. So throughout the emissions reduction planning framework, as well as this webinar, we show example figures and graphs, narratives around a hypothetical organization. So this is our first introduction of it here, trying to develop an example that is applicable to a broad set of sectors. We understand it might not apply to each one of your, every detail might not apply to your portfolio, but in broad strokes, this generally applies to most portfolios. And one of the foundational steps in developing an ERP is developing those targets, which are informed by the inventory, as well as what's needed to achieve emissions reductions to address climate change. It's really important to kind of set those targets and have that conversation.
And I think in parallel with that, Tom, something that's really important, again, going with your co-champions and finding, cultural buy-in within your firm, is making sure that you collectively are setting achievable goals and meaningful targets. So it's not just pulling something out of the air and saying, oh, well, somebody else did this, here's my target, I'm going to do that too. But finding the targets that really emphasize your cultural, corporate culture, and some of those sort of values that the firm had, again, will help get sort of buy into this. And so I think that's a really important element to building that sort of broad support.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I think that the goal should really generate a sense of urgency. It should set action, right? And I think that's also why having these interim goals, like as shown here, this organization has a 50% reduction target by 2030, which is aligned with the Better Climate Challenge. But we also want to make sure that you're set up for success, that you have the time to achieve more deeper decarbonization, more holistic reductions, that you don't end up being relying on some of the easier ways out that might not take as much coordination, but might not have as many benefits to the organization.
Yeah, one of the other things, like, it's oftentimes, when we're looking at, we're like, oh, by 2030, I need to hit this target. And it's hard to get momentum and a plan like this if that first carrot is, 10 years out or 20 years out. And so one of the things that the guide really does talk about is getting those first early sort of incremental wins. And, so our target may be 50% reduction or 80% reduction by 2040, but getting some really early wins, and it could be actually based on work that you've just completed. If a lot of you guys are already deploying efficiency measures across your portfolio, those are incremental steps into achieving these goals. So use that as a celebration of those emissions reductions as even a launch point for a broader emissions reduction plan. So you've already done it, celebrate it. Again, getting that cultural buy-in. Those incremental wins are incredibly important, and it gives you that quick reward, so that people can start to see things are already happening. So you don't risk sort of losing that momentum.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, please. So once we develop the ERP scope of work, the next step is milestone 2, which is categorizing the portfolio. So with this, the emphasis is really on finding what are the characteristics that might lead to different decarbonization strategies, different magnitudes of decarbonization opportunity, really breaking the portfolio down into more manageable pieces. There are a variety of ways to collect and select key characteristics, which are those differentiators, which might include greenhouse gas emissions intensity, total energy use, planned renovations, building type, HVAC system type. There's a variety of different characteristics that you can utilize for this categorization, and it really can depend on what information you already have available and your specific portfolio. So really encourage organizations to look at what is already available. Some facilities teams might already have this information for a lot of these characteristics, and other organizations might opt to use other approaches, including automated building stock assessments or other approaches to be able to identify what those characteristics are and assess the magnitude of emissions reduction potential. After we categorize and benchmark these buildings, we want to select some representative buildings for further study. They might be selected based on their absolute greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gas intensities within their respective categories or upcoming renovations. This really enables organizations to prioritize buildings that would benefit most for implementation, immediate implementation of the measures. Stet, where do you see the benefits of categorizing a portfolio? How might that help you develop appropriate strategies for different buildings?
Well, I definitely think it can help, by breaking a big problem into small nuggets, it helps us get past that paralysis part where you're like, you might have an enormous portfolio across the country of several different building types, and to try to put a plan in place without breaking that down can be really overwhelming. So this categorization process is really key to not only help you identify which measures might be able to scale really easily, but also just letting you focus a little bit on some achievable little nuggets that you can go after, and finding those shared commonalities, whether it's system types, et cetera, that might form a little cohort of buildings. That just helps break it down so that, again, it's all about trying to build momentum, break barriers, and help you implement this broader plan.
Great, and we'll show an example of that on the next slide. So this is, again, our hypothetical example organization looking at their 34 building portfolio. And shown here, the portfolio is categorized based on differences in their HVAC system types. So they have a variety of buildings that are served by different systems, district systems, individual boilers at the building level, and gas-fired package units. Within each of these categories, we're showing the greenhouse gas intensity, which is shown by the color, and the absolute emissions shown by the size. And each one of these rectangles represents one building in that portfolio. Within this example, we've got representative buildings that are predominantly selected based on their higher greenhouse gas emissions and intensities, with considerations for upcoming renovations as well. Next slide, please. With milestone 3, we are then assessing those measures. The intent here is to look at opportunities for decarbonization at both the building and the portfolio level. Within these representative buildings, we are performing emissions reduction audits and analyzing emissions reduction measures. This includes areas such as energy efficiency, electrification, both building and vehicle, fugitive emissions, and on-site renewable energy. We also encourage organizations to select and implement measure packages at these buildings while the results are being applied to the entire portfolio in the next milestone. And the thought is that if you can solidify, if you can align on some of these specific measures, you can just move forward with those while the broader study is being developed. In parallel to the building level audits, portfolio level emissions reduction opportunities are also identified and assessed. That might include district energy studies, fleet emissions, and green power procurement. Based on this step in the building level audits, organizations can begin to develop portfolio level policies and requirements. Next. So in conjunction with the ERP framework, as Hannah mentioned, we are also developing a companion greenhouse gas. We have developed the Better Climate Challenge, a companion greenhouse gas emissions reduction audit checklist for owners. This provides more guidance on how owners can approach building level assessments with a focus on emissions reductions. Next slide, please. So breaking down, giving you a little bit of a teaser for the emissions reduction checklist. Some of the differences that we've seen, or really the need, is aligning on your, making sure that your audits are really aligning with your goals. So since the goals are to achieve emissions reductions rather than reduction in BTUs, for example, or something of that sort. The building level assessments really should be using that same metrics, the same approach, making sure that what you're looking at the building level is really aligning with what you need to do at the portfolio level. So obviously with energy audits, a typical scope, we often see energy efficiency and load reduction being studied, and developing energy conservation measures. And with decarbonization audit, we also want to make sure that we're looking at electrification, EV charging, looking at fugitive emissions from refrigerants, and as well as on-site renewable energy opportunities to develop emissions reduction measures. Stet, can you provide some thoughts on why it's important to frame these building level assessments as emissions reductions rather than traditional energy audits?
Yeah, I think one of the key things and the nuances when we're starting to focus on emissions reductions is making sure that we're taking in, where you are in the country, which grid you might be on, your climate zone, because different efficiency measures will actually result in different amounts of emissions reductions. And in parallel, to this effort, we know that building owners need to have something that they can follow to say, what should we ask for? And really one of the great things about this program is that we've been coordinating with ASHRAE as well. And so there's a companion document for engineers out in the field for ASHRAE Standard 211 that will help them actually have the technical underpinnings to do these audits for you. So you have a list to check, what do I need to have done? And there's a parallel document coming out that's going to help engineers deliver what you need. Again, trying to make action.
Oh, that's fantastic. Great to hear that that resource will be forthcoming. Next slide, please. So next is milestone 4. So this is where we develop scenarios. The purpose here is really to take what we found in the individual building audits and the portfolio wide assessments and apply them to the portfolio level. And this is the intent is to provide different scenarios, different pathways for an organization to really choose and commit to a decarbonization pathway. There are different ways to scale these results and to harmonize the results from the individual audits within the portfolio level analysis. There are different approaches that look at the opportunity at using data from the entire portfolio. And so it's really, it really depends on what your organization's needs are. Certainly some means and methods for what the consultants might be utilizing. But it's really important at this stage to understand how you're going to facilitate that transition, which is why we also encourage developing some implementation phasing as part of this scenario development. We also want to consider any potential changes in portfolio size. So this could be due to leasing schedules, new construction, acquisition, or right sizing of the organization. So making sure that those adjustments and emissions are being considered as well. By developing these multiple scenarios, organizations can test different technical or phasing or financing approaches. There's a variety of different scenarios that an organization might want to look at in order to identify a pathway. Stet, and why might an organization develop multiple scenarios at this stage rather than identifying one specific pathway?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of goes back to like this common theme of getting buy-in from your entire organization. Each of us sit in our little spot, and we might have a scenario that works best for our team. But overall, we're trying to get something that's implementable, that's actionable. We're trying to get buy-in from as many folks within our organization as possible. Having multiple scenarios that you can compare lets each of us look at which levers we can pull and which scenario aligns best with the entire value chain for our corporation. And so again, yeah, those scenarios give us options. Those options let us compare, and we can really move forward and make it actionable.
Right, and what I like about this too is there's a documentation, right, of the process of here are the scenarios we looked at. Somebody new comes into a leadership role in a year or two. They ask, why didn't we look at this or that? Hopefully, the idea is that there's a documentation that shows there was thought put into this, options were assessed, and the organization can move forward from there.
Yep.
Next slide, please. So this is an example of the portfolio level scenario development. So with this example organization, they developed 4 scenarios to study. They varied the, basically adjusted how much they're pulling the lever of energy efficiency and electrification within each of these scenarios. They found that 3 of these scenarios met their 2030 Better Climate Challenge goal of 50% reduction, as well as the internal 2040 goal of 80% emissions reduction. So we can see a way to kind of quantify and explore what are the different potential pathways at this scenario development stage. How else might an organization develop scenarios? What might be considered from a phasing perspective?
Well, one of the key things, and again, it's kind of how it's different than a lot of sort of traditional energy ECM sort of studies, is you have a chance when we are looking at these timelines to align with, lease or turnover schedules that might be happening across your portfolio. And so all of a sudden there's a time value to the discussions. And so looking across of what your R&R budget might be, which properties are going to be getting attention, it's really great to piggyback on top of those other efforts. And again, so you're getting the maximum value out of the investment. So yeah, that timeline piece and lease turnover are key sort of thresholds to start to get alignment with.
Yeah, and I'd add from a timing perspective, I think equipment end of life is also pretty helpful, right? So if you've got major pieces of equipment, boilers, chillers, especially too, when do you anticipate those reaching end of life, and making sure you have a plan that it's there's not a huge urgency when a boiler dies. Oh, can we install a heat pump? There's already some plan, there's some thought to it. Because that is a great time to do it, but depending on different systems take a little bit more work to prepare for electrification, as opposed to something like package units. Although you should still have alignment on what is what is your strategy, and make sure you can have that lined up as well.
Yep.
Great. Next slide, please. After we develop scenarios in milestone 4, it's time to assess these scenarios and then select a pathway. So this is really a crucial step in developing the ERP. We understand that changes might happen to the plan over time based on new technology, industry understanding, changes in the portfolio itself, but it's really important to align with stakeholders and leadership on a selected pathway to move forward. Once this pathway is selected, there are several steps to provide some more definition to the plan. So this includes updating existing organizational policies and requirements, such as renovation, operation maintenance standards, new construction design, considerations for striving for net zero energy for new construction, for example. And then we want to look at defining that phasing and financing more. So understanding how might there be opportunities to finance these measures, how might they be phased out in more time. And then really critical, I believe, is developing that work plan and assigning responsibilities, so that people know walking away from this, it can be a bit, it can definitely take some time and energy, but understand that the completion of the ERP is not the end of this, right? It's just the launch pad for the implementation of decarbonization. Stet, any lessons learned from this step, especially as it relates to the decision-making process?
Yeah, I can definitely say that, having, working with a number of large portfolio owners who are right in the middle of this, you said it right on, is that being able to, the reason that you make an actual plan is so that for each of these elements that you see on your screen, from the financing side to even how you onboard buildings into the portfolio or renovation schedules, you have different entities within your organization that are in charge of those levers in separate ways, but bringing it together into a codified plan that you all agree on, and making sure that each entity within your firm that has those responsibilities takes ownership over their portion is incredibly important, again, to make sure that it's actionable and you're building up this momentum to keep the process going. If it's one person's job in a corner and you're the sustainability head for your organization and you aren't able to leverage everybody else in your organization, the plan isn't gonna work. And so working together on the plan, getting buy-in, and then making sure that each entity has ownership is just, I can't stress how important that is, watching organizations go through this process right now.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I've definitely seen some partners be very successful in
Yeah.
developing this framework, at a high level, providing the guidelines on what needs to be done, and really handing it to different departments. And
Yeah.
here's the overall approach. Here's what you need to implement and incorporate into your efforts. Yeah, the more you can make this align with the natural flow of your organization, the more successful you can be.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So in milestone 1, we discuss an organization selecting evaluation criteria. These are really different areas that are important to them, important to their operation. Here we see an example organization that's assessing these different scenarios with their selected evaluation criteria. Some organizations might find it useful to apply weightings to these different criteria. Others may not. It really depends on the organization and what meets the needs. Almost all organizations will identify cost as a driving factor in some way. So while doing so, it's really important to incorporate all of these potential cost differences between the scenarios. This organization found that by applying deep energy efficiency measures, they're able to reduce the size and cost of the electrified HVAC components. And then by pairing this with the deep electrification scenario component, they were able to provide a larger portion of their energy needs with on-site solar, which reduces the amount of off-site renewables procurement and the overall cost. I think it's, so definitely it depends on the organization, the culture, occupant benefits. How does this really, how can we provide some co-benefits as part of this process? Any thoughts, Stet, on the process of evaluating different scenarios?
Well, and it kind of goes back to at the very beginning of making sure that you're aligning with your corporate culture to develop this. Even the success criteria, these scenarios, weighting criteria should align with your company culture and some of the high value portions of your company. When I see things like risk, for me, I look at folks that have portfolio in jurisdictions that are bringing on building performance standards requirements, for instance. Like that's a huge thing that can be, there's a cost penalty that could be down the road. That's a great way to get everybody aligned really quickly on doing some test examples within that jurisdiction that help you meet those building performance standards, but also could scale to your entire portfolio. Again, just kind of aligning with where your firm is at, where your company culture is, just making sure that these the criteria that you're evaluating the scenarios on aligns with that corporate mission.
Got it. Next slide, please. So as we discussed, our example organization has aligned on scenario 1, which looks at really implementation of deep energy efficiency measures, as well as deeper electrification efforts. So this wedge chart captures how they intend to achieve these emissions reductions. This example is really based on those building level assessments and scaling to the portfolio level with the special consideration for the phasing. So when developing these pathways, organizations might have more detail on the specific projects and buildings to address in the short term. So we have some graphics in the ERP framework that highlight this. Might be useful to look at your short, your medium, your long term. How are you able to break down the action plan for your decarbonization efforts? What else, Stet, would you say organizations should consider when developing their pathway?
Well, I'd say the most important thing just to keep in your mind, because this can, if you haven't done this, this can be overwhelming. But it's the area under the curve that matters. It's the cumulative emissions that we have over time that really matters. And so earlier when we talked about celebrating those early wins and setting some incremental goals right at the beginning, those can be one of the best pathways to getting action on your emissions really quickly and pushing that slope of that curve down as steep as you can. Those early actions are going to have the most impact over time. So when we look at these scenarios, it's easy to say, well, 2040 is a long ways out. We can, we'll figure out how to get there. Start early, start incremental, and grab onto those wins and use those as a catalyst for additional wins, because at the end of the day, it's the area all that sort of purplish tone gray area at the bottom of the graph, that cumulative value is what actually is driving sort of climate impacts. So
Right, we have to act now.
yeah,
And
act
so,
now, act fast, and celebrate.
yeah, absolutely. Have a good time while you're decarbonizing. Next slide, please. So after completing the plan, organizations begin implementation of the plan, really shifting from individual piecemeal projects to a cohesive emissions reduction approach. So looking at this, we encourage taking a look at your emissions reduction plan, revising it, making updates as needed. How might implementation feed back into those updates and revisions for a plan?
Yeah, I mean, what we definitely don't want to do is have a plan that just goes and sits on a shelf. Like I said, we need action. We need to get momentum and that critical mass to keep things moving. Within the plan, setting up this revision timeframe is a great place to reevaluate, new technology. If any of you guys are doing, heat pump applications right now, you know that things are changing really quickly with cold climate applications, heat recovery options. Things are moving at a pace that in 3 years, there's going to be new options, lower cost options. And so it's really great to check in on your plan because you might be able to accelerate things. Prices might be coming down for certain technologies. And so it's just really great to build in this continuous improvement process to the plan. It's going to keep it more relevant. It's going to make sure that you're still tied to your company culture, your company metrics, but at the same time, acknowledge the market is shifting. The grid is changing, technology is changing. And so it's a really, really important to sort of build in that continuous maintenance.
Yeah, definitely. And by developing and then implementing your ERP, organizations can really gain confidence in their decarbonization approach and achieve the deep emissions reductions that we need in this moment. So we really hope that this is a resource that's valuable. Just like we encourage the ERP to revisit over time, we'll also be revisiting this framework, and we'll definitely appreciate input as people begin to sift through it and work with it. Next, please.
All right, thanks, Tom and Stet. That was great. Love the back and forth. Appreciate that. We're going to do another Slido poll real briefly and then go to our Q&A. So here's what's up on the poll. We don't have the descriptions up on the poll, so I'll just sort of go through that. Where's your organization in the ERP process? Are you at the kind of a project focus where you don't yet have a portfolio level plan, but you're doing a lot of pilot projects or other types of projects and buildings in your portfolio, but you haven't started a portfolio plan? Have you had an early effort on a portfolio level plan? Like, let's say you've started to categorize and prioritize your whole portfolio, or developing some pathways towards how you're going to address certain system types, let's say. Do you have significant progress where you have emission reduction measures defined? Do you have some implementation plans, both at the building and portfolio level? And then a portfolio level ERP is drafted with what you're going to do, your timeline, and your funding defined. So kind of the holy grail. So we're going to let you think about that poll and add your results to the poll. Maybe we'll come back to the poll at the end. Right now, we'll just sort of jump into the Q&A and don't need to go directly to the poll results yet. So the Q&A, again, is on slido.com, event code DOE. All right, so we're going to get started with a question around due diligence. So usually investments in energy and emission reduction happen during that due diligence stage before the building is in the portfolio. So could you advise on how the framework can be applied during this due diligence process? Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to jump in really quickly because I have a client going through this right now. So I would say the biggest value of the plan is literally having something to reference. So as you're going through due diligence on maybe a new acquisition for a property, how does it fit within your goals? Are you bringing in an asset that it's going to be really hard to then bring that building to the level of efficiency that you need? Or is it something that, the building has already hit a certain performance target that you're like, oh yeah, this actually reinforces our decarbonization plan. Bringing something on that then you need to bring more investment in later is kind of setting yourself back. So, but if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a target, it's really hard to take that information and share it with the C-suite. From an acquisition standpoint, like, does this make sense? If there's no benchmark to set it against, then you've lost out that opportunity to sort of, again, reinforce the plan and make sure that the plan is still driving decision making.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to move on to the next one. Appreciate that, Stet. So there are a couple questions about how you approach greening of the power grid. And I know in our wedge chart, we have a wedge for the projections for greening of the grid and the benefits to emission reduction related to that. But can you speak a little bit more to that greening of the grid? And even beyond that, does it make sense to electrify buildings in areas with the dirty grids currently?
Sure, I could take this one. Yeah, we definitely encourage you to take the greening of the grid into consideration, which provides more impetus for electrification, and definitely encourage you to look at what are the impacts across your portfolio within different grids. Certainly, there is a variation in of areas that have grids that are more reliant on fossil fuels than others. But by utilizing efficiency, by utilizing heat pumps, we could greatly reduce the actual energy needed and reduce the associated emissions. So definitely encourage that.
Yeah, I would add on that as a stopgap measure. So, oftentimes, we're projecting out what the grid could do, and there's, very aggressive renewable projections. There's less aggressive ones. It can kind of give you an error bar, if you will, for your projection, which is totally possible. But for those folks that are on a grid that's, especially dirty right now, the impact that you can have with adding on-site renewables or adding renewables within your portfolio will have exponentially larger impact today in your portfolio, regardless of what the grid is doing in your region. And so a lot of the measures, that Tom mentioned, efficiency first, driving these efficiency measures, if you pair that with renewables, whether on-site or off-site, through power purchase agreements, you can have a huge impact today. And so you don't have to be reliant on what the grid is going to be doing long-term with, don't let that hold you up from taking action, I guess I would say.
And I'll add that on the on-site piece, it doesn't just help on the carbon side, but it can help with cost as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Okay. Related to cost, that was a good segue.
Because Tom brought it up.
Can you provide more context into how an organization might assess the cost of these different decarbonization pathways? So this high-level portfolio cost.
I don't know, Tom, if you want to take it, I can also step in and
you can start it off.
Yeah, share some examples.
Sure.
So one of the things that the plan really talks about, and Hannah briefly mentioned this early, is building decarbonization audits or greenhouse gas reduction audits at a building level. A lot of times those are going to include sort of a cost of implementation. And one of the real benefits of the plan that that Hannah and Tom have laid out is that you're looking for similar buildings, clusters, types of buildings that you've categorized, and there's a chance to take that financial information that you did with a really in-depth audit and scale that up, really quickly to get a sort of in the wind cost of what would that be on your whole portfolio. So if you have 30 buildings with the same system types, roughly the same age in the use, man, you could just scale that cost information, with escalation and sort of understand how that could play out in your portfolio. And so it's almost like do the small piece that's really impactful and then scale it across the portfolio. So that's one of the strategies that the plan talks about, and trying to look at the impact of cost across a pretty broad portfolio.
I'd also add that I think the framing is really important, right? So as we're looking at these different costs, we're looking at comparing the different ways to achieve our decarbonization targets. So it's no longer looking at does a project clear a certain simple payback, It's really about how do we achieve a meaningful emissions reduction audits that are cost effective, that get us to that target. There are a variety of ways to do it. You can just purchase a lot of RECs, for example, but you know, there are opportunities to achieve a really holistic approach and to minimize overall cost. Yeah.
Great, thanks, guys. So let's pivot to pilot projects. At what stage are pilot projects recommended to be implemented? One thing I like about the framework is that we do stress these building level representative audits, which gives you a springboard into doing stuff right away. You don't need to wait till your plan is written to start implementing. So I wondered if you could speak to when to do pilot projects, how many pilot projects to do, when to stop doing pilots.
I get really excited about pilot projects because you can learn a lot. I would say that start yesterday. Pilot projects could teach us something at any moment. One of the things to think about what pilot projects you're doing, if you've done an LED retrofit, for instance, do you need to do another pilot? It's not, to learn something. It's like, no, you've kind of got the value out of it. So oftentimes I work with clients to start looking at maybe 3 or 4 pilots that touch on major systems, major building types, implement a few that'll give you the broadest sort of understanding of the impact that you could have across your portfolio. And then obviously, phasing those, starting with high emissions intensity buildings is a great place to do a project because you can get a big win, doing those. And again, I like to celebrate any of the wins because it gets that momentum going and can get your team or your facilities folks excited about the next pilot.
And also add, take advantage of other people's pilots too.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in the Better Climate Challenge, learn from your peers, learn from others who might have piloted it. There's really not a need to, pilot solar, for example. We know how it works. It's very reliable. You might want to look at what's the best financing approach for your solar project, but we know how solar panels work.
And I want to give a shout out to the Better Building site because a lot of these really great pilot projects are getting documented by Better Buildings and Better Climate partners. So you can see what your peers are doing. And if there's anything that, leadership in a firm like to know is what their peers are doing. So you can use those pilots, the other folks, as Tom mentioned, and learn from those and apply those.
Yeah, and I'll say physics doesn't stop at at state borders, at county lines. Take advantage of what others have done elsewhere, for sure.
Do we think we can talk about campus level decarb planning in like 1 minute? This is a challenge, guys.
All right, 30 seconds for you, 30 seconds for me.
Okay. Well, I'm in the middle of one right now with 7 campuses within a whole system with some 700 buildings. We are literally following this exact process. The big things is when we start to look at big distribution systems, there's a scale jump that we look at, but there's still a tremendous number of efficiency measures that can be rolled out. The nice thing about a campus scale is that you have a facilities folks has their fingers everywhere. And so you can leverage that knowledge to really take that next step faster than you might if you have different property owners across an entire portfolio.
Yeah, and definitely, we certainly had campuses in mind as part of this as well. In the development, the differentiation is really, your key characteristics that define and contrast your buildings. It's not going to be based on location because all of your buildings are in one location, one climate, one grid. There are other characteristics like building type an HVAC type that you might be looking at instead.
Yeah.
Great, you guys did it. Awesome. All right, the results of our poll, about half are really focused on projects. This is also exactly what we're seeing with our Better Buildings partners. And we provide technical assistance with quarterly one-on-one meetings through our program. So why don't you go back to the slides, Jasmine, and we'll just close it out by giving you some more information if you're interested in joining. So the Better Climate Challenge is still accepting new partners. The commitment is 50% scope 1 and 2 reduction within 10 years. And like I said, we provide technical assistance. You'd get one-on-one meetings with people like Stet or Tom. And we have 150 organizations. So you can click here if you want more information. Next slide. The summit, this was mentioned earlier, we'll have a workshop on April 11th for BCC, Better Climate Challenge Partners and Low Carbon Pilot Partners, going through doing exercises around this framework and getting more thinking into how it applies to your buildings. So that's 11th. We have an emission reduction planning session planned during the summit. We have a low carbon pilot result. There's all sorts of, there's so much on decarb at the summit. So join us there in DC. And I will let Nate close us out on the hour.
Well, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I really appreciate the banter that Tom and Stet have provided around the content we wanted to share with you today. Hannah, your work to pull this resource together is outstanding. And I'm grateful for the attendees that we had. I was going through the list during the call. I think we had a great turnout, and I hope to meet anyone who I haven't yet at the summit this spring, April 11th to 13th here in DC. We look forward to talking more soon. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining.